Etienne. Hello, how are you? Thank you
Hi,
for
Anamaria.
joining me today. I have to say that I'm going back to my notes from our training on a weekly basis. So you're very
wow.
often on my mind. Believe
Really?
it or not, I'm thinking about you every week. You're probably not thinking about me every week. That would be very weird. But thank you very much for accepting my invitation to join me today. I'm looking forward to learning from the OG, the source of communities of practice. And I don't think there's anyone besides you two on earth that has thought about this topic and worked around this topic more. So I'm very happy to bring your perspectives to the audience. And I want to start with a bit of a, let's say, framing. Some of our listeners might know who you are. They might have read some of your books. But if there's anyone listening that doesn't know what communities of practice are, how should they imagine that space? What are communities of practice?
I mean, if you walk into a place, a room, around a table, and everybody's talking shop, and if you're on the outside, you might not understand or care or think it's rather boring. And these people meet regularly to talk shop, right? And talk about what they're doing and the kind of problems they're having in practice and the kind of successes they've had. Then you've probably walked in on a community of practice, whether or not it's called a community of practice. So it's really people who come together and talk about what they do, and through talking about what they do, learn to do it better. And they share stories of what works, what doesn't work, what innovations they've had, how they're dealing with the current culture, the organizational constraints, all those kind of conversations.
And really, in a community of practice, it's the issues of practice, the uncertainties that inevitably come up when you are engaged in practice that drive the learning, as opposed to a training or a course where it is the certainty of a professor that drives the learning. These students need to know that. I'm sure about that, and I'm going to write a test to make sure that my certainty has made it into their head. So the community of practice is different because it's a mutual learning partnership where everybody brings in their experience of practice, both to provide challenges to the learning of the group and to provide possible solutions or possible approaches to address those challenges. So the experience of practice is very central, and that's why we call this communities of practice, because they use practice as a container for learning.
I still have vividly the example that you gave during the course with the lecture, and how you can even use or infuse this learning from practice into what seemingly is a very formal sage on the stage context, right? And you gave the experience of I think it was a neurosurgeon, the surgeon that was giving a lecture, and that stuck with me. Would you mind maybe sharing a bit that story for our listeners?
You mean a therapist?
The therapist. There we go.
Yes. Psychotherapist.
Yes. Psychotherapist at a conference who was talking about her work, right? But she did so in a very interesting, particular way. So I would love to surface that story for our listeners, because it's I have it in my mind, and I remember for me it was like an aha moment. Because I tend to put the lectures like somewhere on the like lectures. Yeah, now really, they're somewhere there. We need them. They're fine. But when you brought that example, I thought, oh, wait a minute. You can actually turn it into a very rich, very personal, and very context-specific learning experience, even if it's just a lecture, someone that, shares something with you.
Yes. Well, it was the psychotherapists annual conference in the US, and there are some psychotherapists become almost guru-like in their status, because people really look up to them and listen to what they say and absorb what they do, and
read their books.
Read their books. Yeah. And she was stood up on this big stage, big audience, and everyone's there ready to take notes or whatever. And she showed us a short clip of her with a client, with his permission, a difficult client. And you watched her navigate and talk to this client in a way that was so impressive. And you thought, wow, I want to be like her. She so knows what she's doing. You know, one day that could be me. Well, except I don't want to be a psychotherapist, but I'm sure many in the audience were thinking, one day that could be me. And then she played it again in slower motion, and she talked us through every single moment about what was going on in her head. And she was there thinking, oh, I just did this. Oh, was that the right thing to do? Oh, no, now look, he's doing this. Oh, phew, everything's okay. And maybe I should try this. Maybe I should try that. And so you were accompanying her in all the uncertainty and what looked like on the outside, this person who knew exactly what she was doing was actually moments of uncertainty which she managed to pull off in a very productive way to bring this person to the place where she wanted him to be.
That is fascinating, because I can put myself in the shoes of the audience very well. Actually, I've attended plenty of lectures. I think we've all been to conferences, and we all see this beautiful painted picture on the slides when the experts, right, they introduce themselves as experts. And by the end of it, you're really left with, well, what have I actually really learned? Because the big questions after these talks is always, but how have you done it? Like, I can see that it's, you know, I see that you masterfully took that conversation up to, you know, up to a good result with your client. But me sitting here probably, I don't know, being a couple of years behind you, or probably just starting my practice, probably doubting, fighting imposter syndrome. I keep on thinking like, oh, I want to be like you one day, and probably also like, I don't think I'll ever be like you, because how did you got there? So how did you do that? And the fact that she just opened up her brain in vulnerability in front of her peers on stage, I imagine the amount of learning that people were able to. So that's how you've made it. That's how you took that decision. That's how you pushed back. That's what gave you confidence to continue or to change your strategy or whatever. Beautiful example. And I think that's such an inspiration even for us as learning designers, to play with these formats that might seem very old school like. Beautiful. Thank you very much.
The good thing of a community of practice where a number of practitioners are in that state with each other. You see what I mean? They recognize the difficulty of practice, and they learn without moving out into a more polished version for consumption in a conference or something. They stay in the unpolished version of their practice together, and so they find this companionship and this ability to help each other, because that form of engagement with the world is the key to engaging each other and to engaging in learning together.
It's very raw and very real and very human. I think it really pushes you to the core of who you are as a professional, but also as a human, then with all your questions.
But it's interesting because it's got so separated from learning. Learning, you know, traditionally or now people think of learning as certainty, as knowing what to do. If you know what to do, then you've learned, right? But if you're interested in learning, you're interested always in not knowing what to do and how you recover from it, how you act productively in it, what you do with what you know and what you don't know.
And actually, that's almost a definition of expertise that we have developed by working with practitioners who are very good at what they do. Is that what makes them really a master practitioner is this ability to remain productive under conditions of uncertainty. You know, it's not so much, I mean, they have a lot of certainties because they have read all the books and they have had so many experiences, they can expect things. But the difference between somebody who is good and somebody who is really a master is this ability to remain fully productive under conditions of uncertainty.
Yes, I love that. And I mean, with the world we're living in, I guess that's not even an option anymore. You can't even just look away. I think there's a beautiful, bright future for communities to come in as this playgrounds to play and sit with uncertainty and try to unravel and make sense of things together and take the space. And I've been in those. I love communities. I lead communities. I've been part of communities, and I have also been in groups where it's very uncomfortable to sit with that unknowing. Like I think also our brains from years and years of there's an answer somewhere in this room to the question that you have. All you have to do is find the expert, whether it's a person, whether it's an article, or YouTube, for sure. There's an answer to your question. So we grew up like that. The teacher had the answer, the professor had the answer, everyone had the answer, and we just had to learn the answer and then emulate it, like share it back, remember it. And so I think our brains are very like hardwired to, it's like, solution. And very often in these spaces is sit with that not knowing, and it's so hard because our brain was no, let's pin this down. So that's fascinating.
It might be useful. It might be useful to say that in the theory we distinguish between a community of practice where this phenomenon happens between people who share a commitment to developing a shared practice over time. Okay, that's what we would call a community of practice, and a social learning space where this happens without necessarily sharing a practice. It can happen between people who are from completely different practices, but find value in learning from each other in that kind of mutual engagement of uncertainty mode. And so our work, a lot of our work is associated with the notion of community of practice, but we have found that sometimes it's too much, it's demanding too much to form a community of practice. It's more productive to have a social learning space, which is a little bit like a community of practice, but without the demand of a shared practice.
Can I pick on something there? Because I'm very happy you brought this up, because when we talk about and also in the support of or peers conversation, hey, I want to start a community of practice. It's very common that our peers that work in L&D, they want to start a community of practice for first-time leaders around the leadership program. Maybe they want to start a community of practice around a specific department. Like we have all of our engineers from around the world to come in this community of practice so they can share and kind of make sure that they don't repeat work, etc. And so there's always this red thread, like you know that you're bringing the people around a practice, a shared practice. And communities, for me, when I think about communities, like there has to be a red thread. Something has to bring these people together. Now, in a social learning space, if we don't have, there is still a red thread there. Like people do feel a gravitas towards something. What is that? What is that gravitas? Is it curiosity? Is it?
So when we give a formal definition to a social learning space, we talk about 3 dimensions, 3 vectors of participation that when they are there, 3 of them present and working together, we have what we call a social learning space. So not every conversation is a social learning space. We want those 3 things to be there. And the first is that people are there because they care to make a difference. Okay. So they're not there, kind of like, because their boss told them to be there, or or they want to pass an exam or something. They want to make a difference. Now, in a community of practice, it tends to be a very similar difference because they have the shared practice. In a social learning space, it could be completely different differences they care to make, but it's still the driver that brings them together. So that will be the first dimension, maybe the red thread.
Yeah.
But it's more a connection than a thread in this case. It's more like, oh wow, this is what you do. This is what you get to do. Whoa, I want to know more. Yeah.
Yes.
So
curiosity.
And also, I mean, because we would actually say that you can try to transform any gathering and make it more of a social learning space. So it's not a social learning space or not. It's like you might say to yourself, okay, how can I, I've got all my family round the table. We always have the same
Mm-hmm.
conversations. We always have the same arguments. Is there a way I could turn this into more of a social learning space whereby, we're there because we care to make a difference? And so I might simply say to people around the table, well, I'm interested to know, what is the difference you care to make? And we might go around the table and say that, which shifts the nature of the conversation. Right? And then a second vector of participation is engaging uncertainty. So it's like really making sure that, you're not jumping in with the answers, because if you really care to make a difference, you don't have the answers. Otherwise, you'd have done it. Right? So you're operating from that space of not knowing. Not that you don't know anything, but you're just in that space where you don't know. And
you don't have the full puzzle, basically.
You don't have the full
and I think it's important to say, the language matters here. We don't say engaging in uncertainty. We say engaging your uncertainty as an offering to the space to drive the learning. Okay, so it's not like glorifying uncertainty. It's saying when you want to make a difference, that uncertainty about how to get there is a driver for learning.
Beautiful. I absolutely love that. Bev, you wanted to say something?
Well, I was going to say the third vector is paying attention. So and if you just think of like any conversation, whether it's the family around the table, you can try to make it, use what you know about social learning to create more of a social learning space than your ordinary, unproductive family dinner where people dig their heels in and argue the same, if you argue at your dinner tables about political perspectives, instead of people digging their heels in and giving the same old argument.
Or thinking while other people are talking, they're thinking about the next argument they're going to make instead of paying attention to what is being said. So this notion of paying attention is really central to create this kind of magic of trying to figure out something together.
I hear a lot of parallels with facilitation. We talk a lot about in teams as leaders, put your facilitator hat, engage your facilitative leadership to open up the conversation and hold the space and ask questions and make sure everyone's voice is heard and they know that their contribution matters and so on. So there are like fine parallels with this. I guess you could call it the space holder of a learning space, the holder of a learning space. Now, I know that you are working with a lot of your clients to bring the social learning spaces, creating them, nurturing them within organizations as well as communities of practice. And I wonder if there is any sort of, let's say, preconditions that you're looking at in a new organization to make sure that they're, I don't know if ready is the right word, if the soil that they have is rich enough or is ready for these types of spaces to emerge. And the reason I ask that is I always see like when we build a community within an organization, we build it in an existing container. So the culture of the organization, the way decisions are being taken, the way people communicate, how they feel they can behave or not, what is rewarded, what is punished, etc. How much space can they take? Are they allowed to make mistakes? All of those little things. That's the container that we step into. And so I sometimes feel, I look back at my experience and I'm like, oh, if I would have tried to build a community in this company, I'm not sure how successful I would have been. Whereas in this other company, all it needs is a spark and people would be like immediately like, yes, we know what this is, we want it. So my question is there anything that we have to look at in the culture? Is there anything like a readiness that an organization needs to have in order for them to engage in such conversations about communities of practice and social learning spaces?
I mean, there are so many dimensions of readiness that if you have one or two and not the others, it might work. Because in the end, a community of practice will create its own culture because members are in control of that space for that moment. Okay. not to deny that the external container is extremely important. I remember working in a government organization in Australia, and somebody said, "Well, but you know, in our organization, people just do your 9 to 5. They put their time and they go home and they don't care." And I thought, then maybe, and I don't know what it was, just a workshop, so I don't know what they did with it. But for me, I felt like if people don't care, they're just putting in their time, or they're just doing mechanical things where what they think, what they care is not relevant, then maybe you should think of something else than a community of practice.
And I think, I mean, we've seen such a range of community practice work, from being under the radar, so that's one way to go, to being sort of fully functional and bottom up, to being top down, because an organization says we need to develop our strategic learning capability, and the community of practice on this is super important, and that's going to be a priority. So there's such a range there. But I think a sort of cautionary tale is more like, if the organization is seeing community practice as a channel for making change happen. So they're thinking, this is the change we want to see. Let's therefore start a community of practice who will then implement this change. Then that organization is not ready for communities of practice.
And we were working with a university where they wanted to start a community of practice among faculty about what was it called? Diversity and inclusion.
Equity and inclusion.
Yeah, equality and inclusion. And the purpose was more to make recommendations to the administration about what policies to establish. And it was like, this sounds more like a task force than a community of practice. It's not so much that people learn how to practice equality with each other. It's almost like a focus group or a task force to make some recommendations, and which is fine. So we're not saying that a community of practice is a solution for everything. It's a solution for a very specific moment of learning. And I think organizationally, what's really important related to that is, does the voice of practitioners matter? Because in order to engage in a community of practice, people have to feel that their voice matters. Okay, and if they don't, then there is not much of a motivation to participate, to invest themselves in that community, because it's like, okay, so it's like this little playground that management has created for kids to play, but they're not going to take seriously the things that we come up with. So I think that's really important. And another one actually that we look at is management ready for the long term? Okay, because one of the problems we have seen in some communities is that the support for communities of practice goes up and down in a management level. And it's like, if people invest their heart in a community of practice, then you have to enable that to be sustained, and so we have seen some organization where every time there is a change in management, they invest in community, boom, they ignore them, or some in another organization that they were even against them, and so to have a certain commitment to take that path, like in social technical design, they say, if you're going to dance with a bear, you don't decide when to stop. Okay. And so, in some sense, communities of practice are a bit like a bear, because they're a bit dangerous. They're a bit wild. You don't know. Actually, if you try to,
you can't predict what they're going to do.
That's right. Yeah. Because they're not there to comply with your demands.
I think that's actually such an important point for that readiness. I sometimes ask, like, how do you encourage, like, do you feel that you can challenge not necessarily authority? Do you feel like you can challenge decisions? Do you feel like you can, disagree with something that is being said in meetings in general? Or is feedback invited and truly listened to? Because if again, higher up leadership, if they're not ready to unleash people and then be like, this is, you're not gonna know where this is going. Like, it's not like any other project that you're like, go from A to B to C to D and behave just like it's like, if you want it to work, you really need to unleash it, like really let it go. And so actually, for some people, sometimes it's like, I actually, especially in diversity, equity, inclusion, right? When you bring people together around the topic that is so personal, and then they come together and then they start to be like, okay, I want to go beyond us connecting. I want to actually look at policies. I want to make our lives better. I want to impact something. And they come up with these ideas where we stop management. It's like, whoa. We are actually not expecting you to come up and bring any change here. We thought that you're just going to do some events, right? Like you're just going to do. And I'm like, okay, I think that's something important to discuss at the beginning, in that when you assess that readiness, hey, this might happen. Are you ready for this? Like, is this welcome here? Because if it isn't,
and even if it's not, twice. Actually, I remember a while back in a big organization, they had a fantastic community of practice. It was actually on process design and in the manufacturing, and really it was a very active, very successful community of practice. But they were angry because management had made an acquisition of a small startup in their domain without consulting them. And it had not worked well. And these people were saying, wait a minute, you have a committee of practice. We know these people. We see them we meet them at conferences. Why don't you ask us? So it was interesting because the committee of practice was not asking, why don't you let us make the decision? They recognize, no, you are management, you make the decision. But you have this amazing resource of people who know this domain. Why don't you just ask us what we think? And we would be happy to spend 2 hours discussing that, But no,
involve us. Involve us, listen to us.
Listen to our voice, the voice of practice. The voice of in a committee of practice gives legitimacy to the voice of practice. And in an organization, from a strategic perspective, that's a very important resource. Because if you're a manager, you live at 30,000 feet. You have to. You cannot be involved in all the practices. There's no way. But then if you can have that connection with communities that can connect the voice of practice to your strategic decisions, that's a real asset. That's a real precious thing.
Yeah. Yes. I'm happy that more and more at least that's from where I'm standing, and you're much more closest to this field and to different big and small organizations and NGOs, government, etc. So probably you're also seeing almost like a revival. Like suddenly it's like people are aware about communities. Sometimes they imagine different things when they hear the word community. So I'm like, that's not really a community. It's a task force, it's a project team, etc. But there's a general, I feel, a much more awareness on the market, if we call it, that communities is like a cool kid on the block. There's something interesting happening there. We want one. And so what Bev was saying about this mandate, it happens a lot. We see this a lot. Peers of mine, people working in L&D, learning in HR, leadership wants to do a community of practice and I have no idea where to start. What is this? How do I do it? Etc. And we treat it very often like a regular project where we go on our desk with a little sheet of paper and it's like, okay, I read all the books, I listen to some podcasts, and then I make a plan. And then I say, this is the purpose, this is what this community is here for. And then I launch it, I announce it, and then I'm like, I created something pretty for you, dear colleagues. This is your community. This is the Slack channel or the Teams channel or whatever the community lives in the forum. 2 weeks in, 3 weeks in, crickets. And then they come, I launched the community. We have a problem with engagement. So does that sound like a typical flow? I see that a lot in practice. Do you see that too? And
yes. Yeah. I mean, it is, well, the idea that you build it and they'll come. But of course, community, just the very word says people. So it can't be empty and then you invite the people in. It is the people.
so here's where I was going, because I know that you two have a very collective, particular, community driven way to launch a community. So I know that you follow a process, you're inviting people in, there's conversations, you're building it together at a foundational aspect from the beginning, from the start. So maybe for our listeners, could you take us through what would this usually look like? There's an organization, they bring you in, we want to launch a community, this is the domain. What does those initial phases, what options do we have there? How can we start to invite people to build it with us?
The thing is, you're always to remember that you're inviting people into a conversation, not into a space, into a conversation. So first of all, the first thing to do is to find out who cares about this, you know? So you need to find who are the people who care about it and who could do with a conversation to talk about it. And so you're inviting people into a conversation with you, with others. I mean, and this is before you start your community, right?
I think it's important to say it's a conversation that happens mostly one-on-one or one in a small group. It's not, it doesn't look like a community yet. And yet these conversations are already community building, but they are in a back channel.
So if you want to start a community, presumably, well, first of all, you've got to think why. Is it because I am passionate about this domain or this practice? It is my domain and practice. Or is it because I'm sitting outside it, maybe in a HR department or L&D department, and I'm thinking, wow, I can really imagine that if these people come together, whoa, it's going to be great. Okay. And
that's
yeah,
usually, it's the second part usually. And you're like thinking, yeah, I bet they would love a community of practice, but I'm like, how do we know?
That's right. So then, well, that's why you have to speak to all the people first that you think, or a sample of the people, if there's many, to find out, you know, where do you already go to talk about things that help you in your practice? Because maybe they've got perfectly good conversations happening somewhere else, right? And to try out the idea with them and to find out what kind of issues would you like to what keeps you up at night, and where could you go for help? Most people like help from their peers, right, about their problems of practice. They don't need, sometimes they think they need an expert, and that's great, you can bring them in, but for the most part people just say, oh, I want to speak to somebody else who's done it like this before. That's what they want. And so you think, well, who would that be? Oh, John Smith, right? Okay, well, then you talk to John Smith. Would you care about this? So you're having these conversations one-on-one with people, finding out who's interested, who to talk about what, and how much time, have they got to do that? How important is it for them? Because it needs to be important for them. So, yeah, so the first steps we always say is pick up the phone and talk to people.
And if you are in HR or in learning and development, and it's not your domain, the first thing to do is to find someone from the domain who's going to work with you, who wants a community of practice for themselves, and is going to work with you. That would be the first thing. And after that, do what Bev says. But what Bev says is best done in collaboration with someone who has legitimacy in the domain, because otherwise, those people from HR, you know what I mean? But somebody who is a practitioner, when the invitation comes from somebody who's a practitioner, don't you think it would be better if we talked more often? That's a different kind of, and it's already building the community because it's building relationship and it is building common hopes, common dreams. Oh wow, yeah, no, if we talk to,
yeah, a very important thing is not a needs analysis. It's not calling people to say, oh, what would you like to talk about? We thought of this topic, and this topic. Which ones interest you the most? Or, what do you need? Okay, well, we can find an expert on that. So their conversation, especially from HR or L&D, it can often be in the conversation often sounds more like a needs analysis. So it really
Or
is
course offering or something.
a course offering.
And
Yes.
why is that? Why is that? Why should we like steer away from that? Why don't we want that? That we usually do that because that's how L&D and HR works. Needs, solution. What do you need? We deliver it to you.
Yeah,
Oh,
because
and
because
that
that's,
can be good. That can be good.
we're not
Yeah.
against it. We're not against that, but that works for things where there is already certainty. Okay, so I want a course on this. Oh yeah, okay, we can organize it for you. Fine.
We arrange an expert. They'll come in. They'll give a webinar, and we'll have it. So that's great. But if you want
we'll
people
send you to this university to take the course or whatever. But it's more like for the transmission of certainty. I want a discussion of that topic. Okay. A committee of
and if you
practice
go to if
is
you
not
yeah.
a series of topics. Actually, topics is a dangerous thing for a committee of practice. Because people say, oh yeah, now I'd like to learn about this topic and that topic and that topic. A committee of practice is anchored in the struggle that people have.
Yeah, because if you think back to what I said, like if you go into a room where people are talking shop about their problems and things like that, so that's what you're trying to get from people. What's going to, make you say, well, oh, you did it like that. Oh, I'd never thought about that. Or, I don't think that would work in my, that level of conversation, which is often relegated in face-to-face conferences or trainings, is often relegated to the tea breaks. That's where people get to talk about that level of practice. But we're saying the learning is in that level of practice. And so if you're trying to get to that, that's why it's important to talk to people and find out what is it that's going to excite them and make them want to join, because it's going to help them improve their practice on Monday next week, maybe in the long run, but it's not a topic in general.
I also find that whenever we ask, what would you need? We position ourselves immediately in almost this service provider, maybe
That's
savior,
right.
maybe like, I'm going to deliver something for you. Whereas, and then we're surprised they're not engaging. It's because that's the culture you created in that space that you're asking, they tell you, and then you do the thing and they participate.
Actually, that's a big mistake. So that's a big mistake we have seen some committee leaders do, is to create this relationship of service provider to the members. See?
And then they reinforce it by... Right.
I sense a lot of passion around this. I love it.
Then they reinforce it by sending out a feedback form at the end of the event to say, so how was it? How was the facilitation? How was this? How was the service that we provided? And then they say,
oh, we do.
Right.
I want to talk about that. I'm going to take a note and I'm going to surface that. Yes.
You can't do that and hope that people are going to be a community of practice, because a community of practice is, people lead it themselves. They lead it with what they're doing. It's more like, so what did you contribute to this meeting? That's what your feedback form should say. How could you, and where could you in the future? Yeah.
I love it. I absolutely love it, because yes, I completely agree. Etienne.
Well, I was just going to say, something there. Well, it's your community. If there is something you don't like about it, do something. Okay, because it's as much your community as the person who is a community leader. So
yes,
actually, we do have techniques. We call them leadership groups, where we form groups of members who take dimension of the leadership of the community explicitly. So that's a little technique we have developed to accelerate the process of ownership of the community by members. Because often in the start, it is started by one or two people. But over time, as a committee matures, you'd like to see more people feeling a commitment to the community that leads them to take some leadership and some initiatives to make the committee move forward.
Yes.
Actually, along these lines, just also to mention that if we're talking about L&D people or HR people, very often the language they use around a community of practice is to talk about people as attendees. right? Or so there's a lot of language which is about, so you don't have attendees at a community of practice. You have participants, or you have members, right? The minimum you have are participants, but they're people who are taking leadership role. And so you also have to be very careful about the sort of language that often L&D and HR use. Yeah.
This made me think, and I fished quickly one of your slides from the course, which also left an impression on me, because I do believe, and I see how simply changing from what do you to from I and you to we.
Mm-hmm.
Even that, in all of the conversation, how can we do that? What do we think about that? Even that makes such an important change. But that, what you just said, Bev, reminded me, and I fished the slide, is this invitation.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember this, you put this, invitation is part of community building. It is
Exactly.
not a PR. It is not a secretarial exercise.
Mm-hmm.
You're already building community through the invitation. And you also
and
said
through the
language
conversations.
matters.
Yeah.
Through the conversation, correct. And then he said
Through the
language
conversation and the
matters. You
invitation.
don't invite.
Mm-hmm.
You don't invite people to attend a meeting.
That's right.
You invite them to participate in the start of a learning journey with peers.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Beautiful. So now we kind of had these conversations with people here and there, and we noticed, okay, there's a group, there's interest, I feel excitement, there's some energy building, etc. What's our next step? How do we capitalize on that? How do we keep the energy ball growing? What would you recommend next?
Well, that really depends on the conversation that you have with people. Okay, if it is, if there is a lot of enthusiasm and people already recognize the need for the committee and so on and so forth, you could do a very big launch. You know, ta-da! We're going to start a committee of practice. But depending on what comes out of your conversation, you may think, oh, why don't we work on this problem together? You know, everybody seems to be struggling with this. Why don't we work on it together? And you know, you give people an experience, and they say, okay, like Bob Dylan says, if this is love, give me more. You know, and so you start a community of practice without saying, oh, we're going to start a community of practice and it's going to go on for 200 centuries. You know, you give them an experience of learning together, and they say, oh, wow, that was interesting. Maybe we should continue. So there are different approaches.
So you arrange another one, and then you say, well, and then people say, well, it would be useful if so and so could be here because they know about this. You say, well, invite them, and you grow it that way. Yeah.
But sometimes
Very
we do
organic.
a more formal launch. Okay. And so there, the danger of a more formal launch is the topic list. Okay. So when we do a formal launch, we usually start with a cafe. I don't know if you've done a cafe conversation where people move from table to table.
Yeah, World Cafe, yeah.
World Cafe, yeah. And the question that we ask them is, what are you struggling with? What keeps you up at night? You know? And that's the question they discuss. And it creates kind of like a sense of learning potential that's very different than a list of topics, you know? Because they start discussing, for me, I always have trouble with that kind of customer, with that like unbearable, and I don't know what to do, and they start thinking, oh yeah, no, I do, me too, these people are always a problem. We need to figure out how to deal with them. You see what I mean? And so, so we start with a question that immediately anchors people, not in topic to learn about, but in practice, to focus on their practice and share stories of practice and share stories of what they're struggling with. We encourage them to share stories. When they talk about what are you struggling with at night, tell stories of how that manifested for you.
Yeah. We're going to bring the stories back in a second, but I just want to make an observation, because you even when you talk about we're doing a bigger launch of a community, it's still workshop. It's still a workshop. People are still around the table. They are still invited to share and discuss. It's not a big auditorium where you invited probably 3 experts to talk about some topics, and that's kind of how you launch it. Right?
Not.
So
No.
Absolutely.
I think it's good to, because sometimes we treat them like too markety. Like it has to be big, and then so invite someone important, and so maybe invite one of the leaders, and maybe invite someone to tell us how important this is, and that's kind of how we launch it, and people are seated in seats looking into one direction. So I think it's an important caveat to surface that even if at this big launch, it's still groups of people gather around the table talking about their challenges and their daily
Absolutely.
work.
And even if you do it
Absolutely.
online, you put people in breakout rooms. Yeah. Whether online or face to face, it's really people discovering that they are learning partners in their practice, not learning partners in their topics, but learning partners in their practice.
And sort of along a similar track is you don't start the meeting by teaching people about communities of practice so that they can go off and apply it. What you do is you give them the experience of being a community of practice. Then you may introduce, it may be helpful at some point to introduce the language of community practice. But for the most part, you're setting up a date, between people. Do we like each other? Do we want to go out with each other again after this? Or do we think we've got not enough in common? So that's the aim of it.
Yes.
Yeah, and
I remember, and I think
and the you see the good ending for a first date is maybe a kiss, but it's also a good ending is let's do it again. That's the ending, not a life plan. You may have discussed how many kids you want, but that's not the point. The point is that was great. We had a great time together. Let's do it again next week.
the
So
point
and
is the second date.
yeah, the
And
point
then
is
the
the second
second
date.
date's goal is the third date. And so
Exactly.
it
And at
kind
some
of
point you
spirals.
discuss, are you interested in marriage? At some point you will
Shall we
discuss
live together first? Yeah.
how many kids you want, is there a problem with the religion of your parents and religion of my parents? You can discuss all that, but you don't start that. You don't come to a first date with a life plan, because the person will go,
Yes.
I'm not ready for that, I don't even know you.
And also if we would start from that, we wouldn't see relationship against the odds. Do you know sometimes there's this couple is like against all odds.
Right.
We're together. If we would have shared, like, because you're scaffolding, you're building the trust, the love, the etc. And so even if later you're like, oh, you don't want kids, I want kids, but because we build certain things, you're ready to make a compromise.
That's right.
And so despite the odds, whereas if you have shared that probably from the beginning, it was like, okay, that's a deal breaker for me, right? There's the scaffolding of love, if we got trust, love, connection, togetherness that we're building through that. So I absolutely love this.
That's why the metaphor works, because communities of practice are not romantic relationships. Sometimes they give rise to them, but basically they are not. But they are a very profoundly human relationship. To find somebody else in this human life who is a partner for you, to struggle with you, with the things the difference you care to make, and will help you approach that difference. That's very profound and beautiful and very deeply
and meaningful.
Human.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very human, very meaningful. I just want to plug in a little tool that I think you might notice and call this something else. But for me, I discovered it years back in the Liberating Structure Toolkit. And I found it that it's a beautiful tool to give people this taste of what it might feel like to bump heads with peers and kind of get ideas, suggestions, etc. It's called Troika Consulting, with little groups of 3, where they take turns to be a consultant and a challenge owner. So they all bring a question or a challenge or a particular thing that they're exploring, and then the other 2. So I think this exists under different names, but for the listeners there, if you're like, okay, I want to host such a workshop, how do I create that experience? I don't want to talk about it, I want people to do it, to feel it. I think that's a very easy format to start to play around with from
There-
the get-go.
there's a lot of great activities in the liberating
Yes.
structure.
We do, with community of practice, we do an extended, a sort of broader and deeper version of the case clinic, because it is about a learning partnership, but it's the same idea. It's like peer consulting. It's like somebody brings a challenge to the table, and you have a process by which you as the group who's trying to help, who's the rest of the members, will try and you'll ask questions to surface understanding. You'll share stories about where it's worked, where you've seen it happen before, and where it worked or it didn't work, and you finally give advice.
So I remember quite vividly when you introduced this format in the training this year, and I remember thinking, oh, it has similarity to other peer coaching and peer learning formats, but in now other format I've seen this story sharing before solution sharing. And I think there's a very particular specific reason why you ask participants to first share stories where they might have probably felt something similar, and then go to solutions. Can you tell us why is that step crucial there, that story?
Well, in fact, when you listen to people talking shop, all right, they may jump in and give solutions, but actually very often they'll tell stories about when it happened to them and what they did as a result or not. Because also people know when you're actually operating on the practice level, people A, know it's hard, and B, they know that advice is often unwelcome, because in my context, in your context, that might have worked. In mine, it didn't. Context matters. So when you tell me your story, I can take from that the advice that I want.
I think the ownership of learning in a story is in the listener. The ownership of learning in advice is in the advice giver. And that's why stories are so important.
Beautiful.
Story doesn't tell you what to do. A story tells you what's possible. And it's up to you to decide how much of it you take and how much of it you let go. Then another part for a community of practice that we have to say is that when a community of practice does that, very important for the community is to follow up 2 months, 3 months, 6 months later. What have you done with the discussion? We want to know, did it work? Did it not work? So because sometimes people run a community of practice as a series of topics. Yeah, and in February we'll address this topic, in March this topic. No, you have to have continuity. You have to have a constant loop of learning. How did it work in practice? How did you adapt it for your context? And what was the result? So you always, as a facilitator, have to make room for creating that continuity of learning over time to improve the practice.
That was the biggest takeaway and aha moment from me for the course. And I realized, whoa, we almost never close the loop. And the community that I'm an active member of and part of, it's considered a successful community of practice. And we're like, we almost never close the loop. Almost no one ever comes back to the community to be like, I've tried what you said, Bev, and this piece worked really well. Or for me, it landed very strangely. So then I pivoted I did something on the spot, and maybe it's useful to you or to someone else.
Yeah.
Or we almost never close that loop. And that was for me mind-blowing. And it made so much sense. And this, I'm happy you bring this up, Etienne, because we're approaching the end, but I can't let you go before we talk about this. This is your value creation model, and it's centered around stories. And that is fascinating, because for me, it's like, how do I get feedback? Surveys. You put a survey, you ask things, and then you have grades and stars. And from a scale from 0 to 5, how happy are you with whatever, with the events, etc. I had so many questions. I remember in the training, I was like, oh, wow, how would I close this loop? Like, actually, what do I do to close the loop? Like, what does that look like in practice?
Mm-hmm.
Do we have to tell people? Do we have to model it? Do we have to create the space? Like, how do we do that? How do we change that behavior? Because it doesn't come natural to us.
Mm-hmm.
And second of all is, why stories? And how do we capture them? They're so fragile. So that was also a question. Well, how do I find the stories? How do I
But
find the
by
stories?
the way, we have just finished a 3-day workshop on the framework. So quickly telling you
That
in 1 minute
that's
is
probably my next visit
right. Telling you
to
in one
YouTube.
minute, yeah,
Yes.
is a challenge. Yeah.
Yes, I
But,
know, I
but,
know, I
but
know.
basically,
Give
what
us
the
something. Give us a little nugget that we can hang
okay,
on to,
so
and then we can research and
our
attend the workshop.
framework identify 8 types of value that social learning can create, and each of these
Yes.
types of value, you can associate prompts or question to trigger the beginning of a story. Okay, so as a facilitator, it would be good to have a few questions, but it doesn't have to be complicated. You know, it can just be. We had this great discussion 2 months ago. Anybody did something with it?
Mm.
You know, it's a simple invitation to the feedback. Now, some communities have gone further than that. Some because the framework suggests kind of a genre for the story of the kind of value that you want to indicate that you received, like a great idea.
So the story is a very basic. What did you get? Something specific, not just, oh, I got a great idea. It's like, what idea? In what circumstance? And what did you do with it? No, not just enough to say, oh, no, I used it in my team. But really, what exactly did you do with it? How did you adapt it? What did you do with it?
And
And
what
what happened?
resources did you need?
Yeah.
And how did your management react? And all these are suggestions for making a story complete so that other people can learn from it. And so some communities have learned this genre. And so they have a check-in. Every time they meet, they have a check-in. Anybody has a value creation story from what we did before? And at the end of the meeting, they have a checkout. Anybody can see a value creation story with what we just did. And they can say, yeah, no, I can see what I could do there. And so you can see how the check-in, check-out creates continuity of learning loops across the life of the community.
I love it. It sparks ideas. I'm thinking our community is globally distributed, so we're all over the place. We're over 6,000 people now, different time zones. I'm almost thinking like, what about a weekly checking? What a checking in on a Monday and a checking out on a Friday, right? So what did you took this week from you probably had one-on-one coffee chats. You probably work with the coach or with the mentor within the community. You probably attended an event, a session, etc. You asked a question, you answered the question. Whatever you did in this week, what is it that you're taking away? What could you see yourself kind of
And
playing
also,
with?
you see, it's actually in terms of learning, it's fascinating because one person says, oh, what I took away was that if I do this, then this, then this could happen. And somebody else thinks, oh, yes, I hadn't thought of it like that. So one person's takeaway becomes lots of other people's takeaway. So they become little quick loops. Yeah.
And
And
that's a learning as well.
this
Yeah.
is where evaluation and learning are very, very closely related. You see? Because the same stories that practitioners exchange in this context can also be used to create a more formal evaluation as a collection of stories that complement each other and start showing you indicators that are important to follow. So if you want to move towards a more formal evaluation, then the framework also suggests ways of doing that by combining indicators and representative stories. But the stories are very important, because you see, in a community of practice, the value of the community often does not happen in the community. Some values happen in the community. Oh, I love being with you. It's so great. So sometimes it is in the community, but often it happens when you go back and you do your work. And so the story, they give you a link between the value in the community and the value when you are at home. And if you don't have the story, that link is mysterious. So if somebody tells you, "Oh, I belong to my community of, math teachers, and I'm a much better math teacher now," fine, it's a nice testimony. But tell me a story of what happened in that community. What did you do in your classroom, and why did your kids learn math better because of that? I mean, you need the detail to know the causal link. Otherwise, it's just like, okay, well, it's interesting, but it's kind of too general to be a true evaluation.
It brings it to life, right? Like you can actually see the value. There's no more doubt there, because if you say, I take a lot of things from the community, or the event's always very valuable, or whatever, that then stakeholders or people you might talk to is like, yeah, what does that even mean? But once you tell them, I took this, I play with it, customer was happy, I finally learned how to manage those tricky clients, those tricky customers that you were mentioning at the beginning, because someone told me a story and I played with that and it worked. That's an example. That's immediate value. That's like, you wouldn't have been able to do that, at least not as fast, as efficient, without the community.
And just to finish that, people think that managers and executives are only interested in numbers. But our experience is a good story really, really helps them understand very concretely why a community exists. So even to talk to executives, a few good stories are as powerful as numbers.
As a graph on a slide. Maybe more, definitely more. As a closing words, what do you think are some of the skills that community leads, people that are striving to start communities, should build in order to be successful? Or the other way around, what are some skills that you've seen, some traits in really successful community builders? What do they do? How are they? Is there any red thread there? It's like, oh, all of them are.
I would say one thing is that there is somebody, the community leader, the person starting it, or somebody else who is absolutely passionate about the topic, about the domain. And without that, you'll never have a humming community, right? So at least one person, because they tend to attract others, but perhaps more than that. But you've got to have that before you even think of starting.
And this passion creates a greed for learning. And what we've seen, these beautiful community leaders, they don't do it as a job. They do it because they need it themselves, They want the community because they need that community, and they are ready to turn heaven and earth upside down to have that community.
Yeah.
Now, there are certain skills, facilitation skills, to learn how to distribute leadership, to invite people to take small initiatives, to tell a good story to management. Very often, an important role to create a narrative that management can understand. Okay, so those are skills that in some communities are really critical, because some communities need resources, and so the person, the founder, or the manager who has access to resources needs to understand what the community is doing, so that they are willing to provide the resources that are needed. So it's often a community leader or a group of community leaders who learn how to tell the story of the community for external stakeholders.
Yeah. We'll make sure to link in the show notes as well, your website with all your courses, your workshops, and all of the things, because if there's one place on earth to go and learn about this topic and build those skills, it's with you two. And I still pinch myself that I was able to to spend a couple of days with you and our beautiful group.
It was great to have you, and we were very impressed by the work you're doing. So the compliment is returned.
Thank you. I want to give a public shout out to the whole core team of L&D Shakers community, because they're almost 60 now, and everyone's pulling their weight with equal passion and love and energy and overtime and working on weekends and working my lunch break and doing all the things alongside kids and life and so on. So it's, yeah, that's what it is. It's the passion you were mentioning, right, Bev? Like there has to be someone that really burns for the domain.
Yeah.
Because it isn't easy. It's work. You need to show up. You need to show up consistently. Thank you for showing up today and accepting my invitation and being so generous with your insights. And hope to see you very soon, hopefully in Sesimbra sometime next year for another learning session.
We hope so too.
That'd be great.
Yeah.